Hello. I assume we're live. I'm also assuming that as the intro music to the wellness policy played, our faces and screens were live on YouTube. Brilliant. Welcome, everyone. This is the wellness policy, I believe episode 42. That means that for 42 months in a row, we have been producing a wellness lifestyle podcast for a pro wrestling network. How novel. Welcome. My name is Jordan. I'm usually not the person speaking at the top. That person's name is Wei Ting, and I think his power is out today. Apparently, Jesse, our guest, Jesse from the Six, you are from the Six, meaning that you live in Toronto alongside Wei Ting. Yes, power is out. That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Thankfully, I still have my power. I haven't experienced any outages. But yes, this morning we have received a torrential downpour. I believe the Weather Network called it a squall. Yeah, I had the misfortune of riding my bike this morning, and many of the streets here in Toronto had turned into rivers. It's a downpour I haven't seen since 2013. Residents of Toronto might remember the big flooding of 2013. Yeah, it's a big deal, and I think in the coming months, drywallers are going to have a lot of work because a lot of people are going to have basements that are going to need redoing. So yeah, I hope Wei gets his power back soon, and I hope everyone listening to me has avoided the worsts of a possible flood.
Yeah, well, squall be damned. Jesse is here for now. Hopefully he doesn't get washed away. Neal, it rains a lot in Northern Ireland. Is it raining today?
Yeah, ironically not today. It's very sunny and nice. And it's about 19 degrees Celsius, which I know doesn't mean a great deal to you, Jordan. But
that sounds okay. Cold.
By your standards, it is, because you've been hitting, I think, 100 Fahrenheit lately, weren't you? So that's like 37, nearly 40, I think, degrees.
I don't like wearing shoes, so I prefer when it's warm out. But 100 plus it's kind of too hot.
Too much.
Yeah, it's too hot. Jesse from the Six is our guest today. When nature calls, that's what we're doing. Jesse, you're the token environmentalist of the post-wrestling community. Is that correct?
Evidently, yes. It's a position I do not know if I am worthy of. But ever since telling Braden Harrington once that Doritos contain palm oil and palm oil is bad for the environment, I have been thrust into this position, and it's something about which I'm passionate, and hopefully today we can give people some useful knowledge.
So my one note I have written down, it says, Braden, why Doritos are bad.
This has come up on Up Next and latterly Poison Rana podcasts a few times. So yes, I think we've got to address some of the detail of that as we go along. Do have a live update from Wei. He's an absolute trooper because he's going to try to get to a cafe with internet access to join us at some point.
Amazing. Well, let's hope more chaos ensues. I think that would actually be fun for the 42th edition of the wellness policy. Jesse, you have just an acoustic guitar in frame. Care to play something for us?
No.
Okay. So help me understand how Doritos is leading to like this extreme weather that at least you in Toronto are currently experiencing.
Okay. Well, there is a link. It is certainly not a direct link. The issue with Doritos that came up, and it's not specific to Doritos. It's an ingredient called palm oil, sometimes listed as palm kernel oil or palm tree oil. In some jurisdictions, they just have to call it vegetable oil, which is very hard. It's an ingredient that's in many confections. It is in the aforementioned Doritos. It is also in products such as cakes, cookies, donuts, margarine, cosmetics, soap, and biofuel. And the issue with palm oil is there's nothing wrong with it in and of itself. It's just an oil. It's a thickening agent. It's a binding agent. The issue is that it's cheaper than most other options, and so the demand for it is very high. Hence, it's in all these products I just listed. And a lot of it comes from the global south, developing world. And we see the issues most starkly in Indonesia, which is a large country with vast rainforests that are becoming less and less vast every year. And one of the main reasons is farmers in these countries who are quite poor, they don't have a lot of money. They need to grow something that can make them money. And so what many of them do is they'll slash and burn virgin rainforest to grow palm trees to satisfy our demand, largely, well, maybe not largely, but definitely demand here in the West, but also in other cultures as well, to grow these palm trees, make palm oil. And perhaps most visibly, this affects orangutans, who, of course, are a great ape. We love orangutans. We communicate with them in zoos and in refuges, excuse me. And we love orangutans, but unfortunately, we're burning down their homes, and they're very affected by habitat loss. And then they often come back to where their homes were that are now palm tree plantations and trying to eat food from the palm trees and they're considered as pests. And sometimes the farmers will then just kill the orangutans because they're hurting their profit margin. So palm oil is something that is quite destructive in its footprint. And it's why it came up in that conversation I had with Braden, suggesting that whenever possible, we should be mindful of what we eat and what we buy. And so something I do is I look for ingredients on packages, and if I see palm oil, I won't buy it. And there is a movement towards sustainable palm oil. Some products now boast that they have sustainable palm oil. Such boasts can be specious. Perhaps they're legit, perhaps not. People look into these things, and it's not always clear. So personally, I try to stay away from it. That's not always possible. There are certain things I'll buy something and only realize after the fact it has palm oil, especially if you're at a restaurant or a cafe, you don't know what's in it.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea is palm oil is one of those ingredients which we should probably try to avoid whenever we can.
So just to set the stage 8 minutes into this conversation, Neal, Wei, and I had a decent conversation, decent meaning length, like an hour or so yesterday, just about these general topics of climate and the environment, the challenges that we face as a global society when it comes to these things. I think the three of us are on equal footing as it relates to our ignorance, but also our curiosity with these topics. Jesse, it's evident in you taking us from Doritos to the destruction of habitat for orangutans. You know a decent amount, like at least you pay attention to these topics. I'm curious at the jump, and this conversation will be Neal and I just being both ignorant yet curious about these topics. Where did your interest, or dare I say passion in these topics first develop for you?
I don't know. I can't recall an instance where there was some sort of eureka moment and I thought, oh yes, climate change, or oh yes, the environment.
Was there a person, like a teacher or a family member, that would engage with you about these topics?
No. No, I'm typically the person most interested in and concerned about environmentalism and climate change in my life, of people with whom I interact on a face to face. I think I'm just a person who I love to learn. I spend a lot of time just reading and researching things, and this is very important. So eventually I was going to come across this, sometimes I'm reading about what happened to the Mid-South Territory in 1986, and sometimes I'm reading about soil degradation and how if we don't get away from monocultures, we could deplete all the good soil and have widespread famines within 20, 25 years. I think it's just something I like to take in information, and I am someone who has the privilege of a fair amount of free time, I think, compared to a lot of people, and I use a lot of that to learn and research. And the more I learned about this, the more it became clear to me, like, this is the subject matter that matters most. It is the existential crisis among several existential crises we face as a civilization, as a species even. We are in the midst of like the sixth mass extinction event on the planet, and we are causing it, by and large, human beings. And so I feel, as someone, and I was going to get to this later, but might as well state it for the fact now. I am someone who lives in a developed nation in the global north, Canada. I'm above the poverty line, and that makes me one of the richer people on the planet. Mm-hmm. I'm not a billionaire, and those are the ones who hold most responsibility for the problems we face, but I am a privileged person in many respects. And so with that comes responsibility for me to educate myself, to make better choices, because I can afford to do so. And now I've been given an amazing privilege by Jordan, Neal, and Wei to come on this platform and talk to people, try to avoid ranting at them, try to avoid a rage dump, and to tell them the things that I know, and perhaps steer people in direction to say, hey, this is a much bigger deal than how it's usually portrayed in the media. I mean, in terms of coverage, not so much like wording and whatnot, but sort of in terms of like, this should probably be the main story on like the front page of the newspapers like every day. But because it's a slow moving crisis, it's not always top of mind. And that's just human nature. And I'm not really sure anyone's to blame for that. But anytime I can get it back in the forefront of people's minds, I think I have a responsibility to do that. And hopefully I can do that today.
But no pressure. Respect.
I was wondering, Jesse, if we've started with a fairly specific example, which is very instructive. I, for example, one of my favorite snacks is oat cakes, because they have very, very little sugar in them. They're basically just kind of a concentrated porridge. But I realized after listening to you that these things, at least the brand that I was buying, are made with palm oil. On their website, they claim it's sustainable. I don't know whether that's true or not. You've touched on this, so it's interesting to be educated about something on the micro level that has, potentially a huge impact on a particular species and all the rest of it. But I was wondering if we could zoom out a little bit to the big picture, because I think a lot of people don't even really get the slogan of keep 1.5 alive, which I've heard a lot about, because during these international conferences, the COP conferences, that seems to be the main aim, is that global warming is happening. It seems to be unstoppable, but there may be things that we as developed nations can do to at least cap the level of global warming. So I was interested to know about the 1.5 Celsius warming. What's that about? What's the time frame for that? What are the potential consequences of not hitting it?
Neal, Jesse mentioned mass extinction is possible. Yes. To me, that sounds like I might be affected. So from a selfish perspective, what does this all mean, Jesse?
Okay, to begin, I think it's important to lay out a caveat that we are tampering with systems in ways we don't fully understand. We cannot possibly know the full ramifications of what we're doing, because of the planet that's actually closest to Earth is Venus. And Venus is the hottest planet in our solar system, even hotter than Mercury, which is closer to the sun. And that's because Venus has experienced a runaway greenhouse effect, which means something happened in the course of Venus's existence, naturally, that caused it to create a positive feedback loop that it just keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and now it's unimaginably hot. And we are doing something similar here on Earth. Now, it's very unlikely that we're going to turn Earth into another Venus, but it is possible. So that's very concerning. So one example here is, I think many people know that as the planet warms, ice is melting. This is melting sea ice, and more problematically, it's melting ice on land, specifically in Greenland, in Antarctica. And Neal, you asked about specifically 1.5 degrees, and that was the target set out by the Paris Accords. And when you research this, you'll find different sort of criteria laid out, like this might happen if we go past 1.5, this will happen if we hit 2 degrees, sometimes between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And we don't know exactly when what is going to happen. So that's why it's a little bit vague, but typically it looks at if we exceed 1.5 or hit 2 by the end of this century, what are some of the things we can expect to happen? And one of those things is the melting of sea ice. And I have a little crib sheet here. So the positive feedback loop we're creating, this would be land ice, is that ice reflects sunlight, right? It's bright, it's white. So light hits it and a lot of it bounces back out. So that cools our planet. But as we're melting the ice, that sunlight is now hitting land and it's being absorbed. And so it's not just that the ice is melting into the ocean, therefore rising sea levels. It's that with the absence of that ice, that's now creating the conditions to get hotter and hotter. So it's feeding in on itself. And we don't know exactly how that is going to affect things. It's not as simple as saying this much carbon in the atmosphere equals this much temperature rise. We have models that can predict it, but when we look at what's actually happened, in most cases, the level of heating is exceeding most models. So it's actually getting hotter faster than scientists have predicted in many cases. And a lot of that is like local predictions. Like one thing that I see a lot online is the temperature, the surface temperature of the North Atlantic, which is setting records that basically no one predicted. And it's very concerning. And so if global, so limiting the temperature to 1.5 degrees, this is above pre-industrial levels, by the way. So we're going back to the temperature in like the 19th century. That's what we mean when we say 1.5 or 2 degrees. We mean above the time in which human beings started spewing carbon into the atmosphere for energy, for heating, for things of that nature. So limiting the temperature to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels could have the amount of sea level rise. So between 1.5 and 2 degrees, if we hit 2 degrees, that could double the amount that the sea levels rise than if we just hit 1.5. So that's an example of how 1.5 is much safer for us and for other species than 2 degrees is. And goes with that, like all the people living near lakes and oceans, what happens to their homes? They have to leave, they have to migrate somewhere else, they're going to lose money, insurance costs will go up. We're going to get more frequent and more intense storms, like hurricanes and rains that we saw in Toronto today. That's normal. Those things happen. But with climate change, we'd expect them to happen much more frequently, and that will cause a lot of damage. So that's one example of why 1.5 is far preferable to 2 degrees. And this is a bit long-winded, but let me just finish by saying too many people consider the climate crisis to be like a cliff edge, right? They think at a certain point, or perhaps even past the point, and we are going off the cliff. And then that's it. That's doom. That's not helpful or accurate. It's more like a slope. And the more carbon, not just carbon, but carbon's the biggest issue. The more carbon we put into the atmosphere, the more we degrade the environment, the steeper the slope gets. So if we can pull it back to 1.5, it's a gentler slope. It gives us more of a chance to stabilize the effects on our economy and the way we live, and to avoid massive species die off. So it never gets. One of my favorite cartoons is Calvin Hobbes, or comic strip is Calvin and Hobbes. And there's a panel of Calvin where he's imagining he's holding this helium balloon and he keeps floating up in the atmosphere. And he says to himself, I guess eventually the atmosphere differential will cause the balloon to pop and I will plummet to Earth. And he pauses and he looks at the the camera of the comic panel. And he says, that's the remarkable thing about life. It never gets so bad that it can't get any worse. So as bad as it gets, it could always get worse. So there is always reason for us to try to make things better. So even though today you're going to hear things that are concerning and despairing, we cannot give into that despair. We have to do what we can to limit the damage and get things back on track to 1.5 degrees, ideally.
One of the things I hear, Jesse, a lot is that, in some of the nations that are probably less likely to see the sharp edge of that effect, there's more, and I count myself in this, there's more apathy, I guess, about all of this. And yet those people who live in areas where they have far less clout, and I'm talking about the Pacific Islands that come to mind, I think Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, places like that are extremely worried about this in the Pacific because the 2 degree mark really spells actual doom for their island nations. The sea level rise we're talking about is enough to swamp them. So I think that's kind of sobering. If some people in North America or Europe feel like, well, the coast gets a bit smaller, we can deal with that. It's kind of, I think all this to say, I think the level of education on this is low. And I count myself as an interested party, but some of the stuff you're talking about today is new to me. I didn't know, for example, what the 1.5 was relative to. And as you've explained that it's pre-industrial, meaning, before we started.
I've also learned
smokestacks and all of that.
Even just you sharing the idea of light bouncing off of ice produces a cooling effect. Like, yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. And if there's less ice, then there's less of that effect. So you mentioned that a lot of what I suppose scientists are looking at are post-industrial changes in carbon emissions. Can you explain to me what that actually is and in what ways we are producing or emitting more carbon that's having these negative effects on the on climate or the atmosphere?
Yeah, sure. So carbon is a greenhouse gas, and a greenhouse gas is something that in this case, human beings are emitting, but they're also emitted naturally by various geologic occurrences. It goes up into the atmosphere, and what it does is it traps heat. So the sun heats the earth, sunlight hits the earth, warms it, and then that heat comes up to the atmosphere and dissipates into outer space. It's part of Earth's natural cooling mechanism. But carbon is a gas that traps that heat. So it limits the planet's ability to cool itself down. And carbon is the key greenhouse gas because there's more of it than any other one. So methane is actually even more effective at trapping heat. And methane is natural gas. Natural gas is just a advertising word. You'll see it, we burn, clean natural gas. That's a lie. There's no such thing. Natural gas is just methane. And a big emitter of methane is cows. Cows are, so we might get in this later, but in terms of diet, beef is the worst thing you can eat for the environment. Cows emit a lot of methane, and it's nowhere near the amount of carbon, but methane's more effective at trapping heat. So methane's also a key greenhouse gas. So when we take fuels such as coal, oil, methane / natural gas, we burn them to create energy. And that could be energy for a power plant to bring electricity to homes and businesses. That could be for heating. It could be fuel for our automobiles, for ships, for airplanes. We use it in so many things. And I believe that, actually, I'm not going to say it because I don't have it written down, but carbon is the biggest problem. The fossil fuel industry, rather, is the biggest polluter in terms of greenhouse gases. And below that is animal agriculture. And And those are basically the two things we got to focus on if we're going to solve the problems we're in. The good news is we actually have the solutions. Renewable energy. We can take the energy the sun gives us, trap that in a solar panel, and convert that into energy. We can take energy from wind, the spin turbines, and use that. We can take tidal energy, the energy of the tides moving in and out, to power us. Geothermal. If you've been to Iceland, you know that most of the country is powered by geothermal energy. We have the solutions. It's a matter of scaling them up and making them work to fit our needs. The impediment to that is political. It's our whole system is built on oil. Oil's been the most important ingredient to our society and our power and our successes from the late 19th century up until now. Everything's built around it. So it's not easy. You can't just snap your fingers and go from there. But we have the tools to do it. What we're seeing is fossil fuel companies are fighting this because it affects their bottom line. The system that we've designed is for them to grow more and more every year to reward their shareholders. And so rather than invest in renewables, which some of them do, none of them to a huge extent, they often spend money lobbying politicians to not enforce the kind of changes that we need to see. And so that's why we're having such an issue transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, even though that transition is going to happen. It is inevitable for us to continue to exist. We will make the transition. The question is, will we make the transition before countries like Vanuatu and the Maldives and Samoa disappear, before New Orleans disappears, before the Sahara grows, before, frankly, millions of people die, and many species go extinct? That is what we're looking at here. And also, as I mentioned before, the longer we prolong this transition, the more we're tampering with systems we don't fully understand. There's evidence to suggest that we've actually altered the North Atlantic jet stream that brings warm water to Europe. That's already changing because we've warmed the oceans to a degree that's messed up the way currents work. No one, well, not that I know of, anyone predicted this like 30 years ago. So we need to push past this resistance to change and say it's going to have to happen now, because the longer we wait, the more we're rolling the dice on our children's futures. And to me, that's unacceptable. So that's another long-winded answer. I apologize, but there you go.
Not at all. I'm thinking what you said about, the petrochemical industry, the oil industries. This is a for dummies question, and I think I know the answer. Does that apply to nation states where oil is plentiful? I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia. I'm thinking Canada, I believe, has a lot of oil. US. So, there's a source of wealth there, and therefore, I guess, an impetus or some sort of motivation, not to explore and really go all in on renewable sources. Is that fair?
Yeah. So, okay. So in Canada, we see ads on television sometimes, and I've heard people in person speak to something similar, say that oil is one of the natural resources that is most plentiful in Canada. We have oil. The world needs energy. We should bring that oil out and give it to the world, make ourselves rich, and give the world the energy it needs. It's a win-win. What's the problem? Well, the problem I think I've already made that clear is that it jeopardizes our species' future and the future of many other species. And the oil in Canada is particularly dirty because they're in tar sands, and that means to get it out is a particularly environmentally damaging process and a very expensive process. Mm-hmm. In one of the notes I took here, I just took a screenshot of countries by carbon emissions. I think this is pure carbon, and Canada was 7th on the list. We are not a very large country in terms of population. So we are doing far more damage than our population suggests we should. And that is under a government that we've had in Canada for 9 years now. That's, hemmed and hawed about reducing the amount of fossil fuels we create, of trying to be green and claiming it. And that government is very likely going to lose the next election, probably sometime next year. And in come the Conservatives. And the last time the Conservatives were in power, they were effectively an oil company, a trench coat. That's who bankrolls them. They are full in on the oil companies. And I really fear for the damage that our country is going to do for the world if and when that happens. And the sad thing is that the degree to which fossil fuels will even make us rich is a murky one, because a lot of the profits fossil fuel companies generate are from subsidies. People will say, oh, but renewable energy, it's not profitable because it needs so many subsidies. We do subsidize renewable energy, as we should. Many governments do, but not nearly as much as we subsidize fossil fuels. So I have written down here, global fossil fuel subsidies were $7 trillion, or 7.1% of GDP in 2022. I think that's from the scary World Economic Forum. I also have listed here that every year, this is Canadian specific, every year federal and provincial governments use taxpayer dollars to provide financial support or tax breaks to fossil fuel companies. These subsidies cost Canadian taxpayers at least $6.3 billion, or roughly $214 per taxpayer every year. So about every year, I pay $214 to give money to fossil fuel companies, which are already some of the richest companies in the world. And that's to create a product that's damaging the entire planet. And it's also holding us back economically, because we could be using that money to invest in the future, to invest in a renewable energy grid. And then we could use the technology and innovations that we create here in Canada and give that to developing countries and help them develop in a cleaner way, and also sell some of that technology to developed nations to help them get their grids working in a more renewable way, more sustainable way. There's money to be had in the green economy. In the United States, by some estimates, taxpayers pay about $20 billion every year to the fossil fuel industry. We are subsidizing our own demise in many ways. And that's what makes it so sad to me, because climate change costs the world $16 million per hour. And from a report from a group called Swiss Re, or R-E, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but the report states that the effects of climate change can be expected to shave 11 to 14% off global economic output by 2050, compared with growth levels without climate change. Swiss Re is one of the world's largest providers to insurance and insurance companies. Mm-hmm. So about $23 trillion in reduced annual global economic output worldwide from climate change. So next time someone says, oh, yes, but the economy will suffer if we transition too quickly or if we transition at all. No, the economy is going to suffer far worse from climate change itself. And the longer we wait, the more damage we're doing to ourselves. So that's the reason. Oh, we have way.
We do. We have way.
I weigh. That's the reason why it behooves us all to move as quickly as possible to a more greener energy system and greener economy.
Thank you, Jesse.
Wait, there might be a delay. Where are you right now?
I'm at a coffee shop. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Looking good,
Okay.
Way.
Thank you. Yeah, nature called and called me over out of my house into a coffee shop. So apologies, everybody. Apologies for the late start. Apologies I couldn't have joined the conversation earlier. How has it been so far?
It's been great.
Catch me up.
Well, we're doomed. I think.
Yeah, we're fucked. So Jesse, this does sound pessimistic, but perhaps realistic as well, because I feel a sense of helplessness as just one mere citizen of my country in the US. Like, are we kind of just waiting for big oil or big food or those that stand to have profits affected by changing dynamics in the energy economy? Are we just waiting for them to figure out how they can properly adjust to profit off new forms of energy. And once they've figured that out, then things will seemingly start moving quicker, assuming that they're the ones who are actually controlling our politicians.
I think that's a reasonable interpretation of what we as a society, as a civilization, are doing. It's subjective, though, and exactly how you feel about that will probably be informed by your political beliefs. Many people believe that we can solve these problems within the framework of capitalism, within the framework of capitalist innovation, and the private companies that create the solutions to the climate crisis will profit, and then we'll move to them. Others believe no, that capitalism, at least in the way we practice it, is creating this problem. It's got us in this mess, and we need a different system, or at least tweaks to the system, to solve it. I have my own beliefs on that, but I don't really want to push those beliefs on anyone right now. In terms of the solutions, I think what we're basically doing, and when I talk to people about this is often what I hear. It's like, yeah, but someone's going to invent a way to take carbon out of the atmosphere, right? Then we'll be okay. Maybe that might happen. And we basically seem to be behaving with that mindset. At some point, some very clever person is going to develop a very clever system to take carbon out of the air, which is, there's two kinds of carbon capture, by the way. The kind I'm talking about is called direct air capture. If someone says carbon capture, that's about capturing carbon emissions as they are emitted. And as far as I can tell, that's nonsense. That's a magical powder, witch's curse. That's BS. That's never going to happen. The idea of taking carbon right out of the air theoretically could work. And in fact, if we stopped all fossil fuel emissions tomorrow, we would probably still need to figure out how to do that, because the Earth will continue to warm based on the amount of emissions we've already produced. So I hope someone does innovate that. The issue is, if someone does it, it'll probably be paid for by a government. Government will fund it. And the companies that have become rich creating this problem for us will continue to profit. So that means we're going to pay for the damage they created, and they and their shareholders will never face any of the consequences, which doesn't seem right to me. You can decide if that's right to you. Unfortunately, we don't know if anyone's even going to develop a direct carbon air capture system that works. So we need to focus on what we know works, which is switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy as quickly as possible. And within the frameworks we have now, I think the best ways to do that is to pressure governments to stop giving out fossil fuel subsidies. Stop it. Now, subsidies can come in various ways and they're hard to measure, but no more tax breaks. No more just giving them money, which is what sometimes happens for projects. Instead, give all that money, or ideally give that money to renewable energy projects, or just lower taxes, or invest in healthcare, invest in whatever your specific jurisdiction needs. That money could go to that. That money could go to you as a rebate, as a taxpayer. That could be, in Canada, what was it for Canada, $214? That could be $214 in your pocket every year, instead of going to an already extremely wealthy fossil fuel company. So within the frameworks we have now, what we need to do is pressure our political leaders to end fossil fuel subsidies, and where possible, increase subsidies to renewable energy. And one thing I'll add, what we can personally do in our lives, if you have money to invest, I really do implore you to look into what are called ESG options, environmental sustainable governance. These are not perfect by any means. I'm sure a lot of them go to dodgy things. But what that basically is, you can go to a financial institution and say, I don't want my money going to fossil fuels. And they will invest your money into renewable energies, more sustainable projects. And the returns on that will likely not be as high as returns on just a general mutual fund. If you're in a general mutual fund, you're investing in fossil fuels. And right now, that will probably give you a slightly higher return, maybe a slightly lower fee. But long term, it might doom the planet. So I really recommend, if you have the funds to invest, please look into more environmentally sustainable funding, because that it puts money going to better places, and it also shows financial institutions that there's demand for it. So that's something I recommend that you personally can do if you have the kind of money that you can use to invest. Because not everybody has that, I understand.
Quick related question, Jesse. What about carbon offsetting? I fly occasionally. You do. I mean, you're not immune to taking a trip by air now and again. And I know that there's an option to try to offset the carbon that you've used on your journey through various means. It kind of feels like that. I don't understand how that can possibly work or do good, really. So can you talk a little about that? Do you know much about it?
Sure. This gives me an example to humanize myself and point out my own follies, because I used to be a big believer in that. I'm like, great, I can still go on my trips. I love traveling. I used to be a travel writer. And then I can just pay a carbon offset and feel good about it. I think it was George Monbiot, a writer for The Guardian and author, who likened carbon offsets to papal indulgences, which were popular in medieval Europe, where you could do all the sitting you want and then give money to the Pope, and the Pope would absolve you. You could go to heaven. It's all bunkum. They've tried to investigate these and trace them to see if they're actually going anywhere that helps. In most cases, they're not. So yeah, if you're getting a flight and there's a little box at the bottom saying, hey, do you want to pay $50 to offset the carbon of your trip? I would look into whatever project that is, the affiliation it has with that airline, and there's a good chance it's not legit. What you can do, because I don't think anyone's going to stop flying, because some of us can't, and a lot of us don't want to give up some of the few pleasures we have in life when we are just regular people. We don't have mega yachts. We're not flying every week. We're not burning a giant pit of methane gas in our backyard for fun. We're just trying to live our lives, and why should we give up the few joys we have? So if you do want to go on a flight and you are concerned about it, I would say, instead of just ticking some box and paying $50 to some carbon offset project that you not even sure if it works, to just instead donate that money to a charitable organization that you know and trust, like the WWF, perhaps. But Greenpeace is many. I shouldn't choose a single one, because there are many options that do many great things that you can choose to invest your money in, or rather donate your money to, for a good cause. So yeah, I would be very wary of carbon offset programs. Because they're probably not doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, which in theory is just preserving like virgin rainforest and help it soak up more carbon. But treat them very skeptically.
I think, Jesse, you're highlighting certainly a predicament that the three of us were discussing yesterday and find ourselves in, and dare I say maybe most of us. Like, by definition, most people are average, meaning, and this is relative, but average income, average amount of consumerism, etc. And what you're suggesting, even the example of investments and mutual funds, is it's going to take a sense of sacrifice, and the sacrifice may be less money. The sacrifice could be less pleasures or luxuries. And this idea of sacrificing on the individual level, especially if you feel like your impact on these things is so minuscule relative to large multinational corporations, for instance. I think this is just where we found ourselves in conversation yesterday, this idea of convenience and what each of us at an individual level are willing to sacrifice or not. And that's certainly how I wrestle with these things. Like, if I ride my bike instead of driving my car, if I recycle versus not, like if I choose to eat chicken versus beef, like sometimes I wonder, is this meaningful? And I understand that if maybe, quote, all of us do it, then there could be a meaningful impact. But I think I'm speaking not just for myself, but for many, where it feels sometimes futile, or I can feel a sense of powerlessness in the change. So I'm just wondering how you would respond to that. And I don't know, like, is this just a marketing problem, like that we aren't effectively communicating or organizing in certain ways? I realize I teed up a lot, but I think I'm also just feeling my sense of frustration in these difficulties.
I mean, I think you've really touched on perhaps the most salient conversation we can have today for our listeners and viewers. The question of, can I make a difference? I think it really speaks to the human condition, speaks to existentialism. You know, do I matter? I'm one of 8 billion people who exist now. Do I matter? That is far too deep and broad a question to answer. And on the other hand, the answer is simple. The answer must be yes. Because if you don't matter, nothing matters. And then, you know, you might as well just go off into a meadow and be a complete hedonist or a complete nihilist and wait for the end. I would say in terms of, so I stopped eating beef. I stopped eating pork. I stopped eating fish because we're really overfishing the oceans, and fish stocks have been depleting at an incredibly alarming rate over the past 40 to 50 years. Those are choices I made. I fly less. I have not completely forsworn flying, although many environmentalists would say this is the most basic thing that I should do, and perhaps they are right. I've made those decisions. I feel good about them. They have not been particularly difficult for me. There are times where, you know, I want to get a hot dog and the veggie version costs more and tastes worse, and I'm annoyed. But it hasn't been hard for me. So I'm happy to make the sacrifices. And I would encourage all of you and all the listeners to do likewise. And I'm not saying to do it all right away. Eat less of it. Eat less beef. Eat less pork. Try to drive or take a train next time instead of flying. That one's harder because that one touches upon the second thing, which is we often don't have the infrastructure to make alternatives to flying practical, right? I should be able to hop on a high-speed train and get to Montreal in a couple of hours. I shouldn't have to fly. It's ridiculous. So what I would say to people is, please do try to make personal sacrifices in terms of, like, eat less meat, fly less if you can. But if you don't pair that with political action, you are wasting your time. You are wasting your time because you not getting a hamburger from a fast food restaurant and you not getting sushi next week or getting veggie sushi instead because you're concerned about fish stocks, that means nothing if you don't also write an email to your political representative and say, hey, I care about this. Please do something, or call them, or sign a petition, or join the mailing list of a local environmental group or a global environmental group. Pressure your government to build high-speed trains, to build that infrastructure. Pressure your local government to spend the money on public transit so fewer people need to own vehicles. These are the kind of things that will make real change. So if everyone who can hear my voice all stopped eating beef tomorrow, that would be great. It would still be meaningless if we don't all pressure our elected representatives, assuming that we all live in democracies. Some of our listeners and viewers may not, and your representatives may be even less caring about your needs than ours are, which is a scary thought. But at least for now, in Canada and the United States, the United Kingdom, we do have democracy. And if we keep bullying our representatives, they will eventually do what we tell them to do. And so I would say, yes, try making small sacrifices. I think you'll find you don't miss that hamburger so much. You won't regret taking the train instead of flying if you have a train that's a reasonable price.
Yeah.
But if you're going to do that, please also take some time to get politically engaged. Find a community organization that reflects your values. Get in touch with your local representative and see what they can do for you, because that is how we're going to make the change that we need to make.
Awesome. We do have a caller waiting, Jesse, but I wanted just quickly before we go to him, something again that's tangential to what you were saying about democracies and the West and so on, and being able to lobby political parties. And an argument you often hear from some is, well, what's the point when some nations like China and India are not pulling their weight? They create so much carbon. They're still using coal-fired energy production facilities, et cetera, et cetera. What have you to say about that talking point?
Well, firstly, I think that talking point is often made in bad faith, because what you're effectively saying is, what responsibility do I have to make the world a better place if not every single other person also does so? Is that really how you want to live your life? Do you think that's moral and good? But speaking specifically, People's Republic of China is the single biggest investor in renewable energy. They are the biggest emitters in carbon, that is true, but they're also the biggest investors in renewable energy. They invest about $546 billion in clean energy. I think that's for the year 2022, and that was nearly half of the world's low carbon spending. So yeah, China emits a lot. A lot of what they emit is because of their industrial output, which is to make stuff for us in the West, in the global North. They're making stuff that we buy. So it's still our emissions in many respects. Secondly, they are, as a nation, doing more than any nation in terms of pure numbers to invest in renewable energy. So I wouldn't worry about China so much. They're actually doing pretty good in terms of investment. Now, China is a complicated country, and I can't claim to understand their entire government or their industries and economy. So I can leave that for a China expert, but that's just the raw numbers. They invest more in renewable energy than anyone else. So they are working on it. India is third in CO2 emissions in the world. The United States is second, which makes sense. It's the second, perhaps now the largest nation in the world in terms of population. Some sources listed differently if it's India or China. A lot of the coal that India burns is not from India. It's from other countries, including Australia. Australia is mining coal and shipping it to India, and then counting that coal as India's carbon emissions, not Australia's. Now, this may have changed slightly. They had an election in Australia, I believe, last year, and they elected a more progressive government. So I don't know if they have plans to change this or have already changed it. I'm not an expert in Australian politics, but that's just an example of how we in the global North are kind of two-faced about this. We complain about other countries' emissions to justify our own inaction, when in many cases their emissions are also our emissions. And what we should be doing is giving developing nations the technology and the wherewithal to develop their economies with renewable energy. We should be making solar panels for them, helping them build wind turbines, whatever works for that nation's particular geography and environment. And there's plenty of money to do that. Again, if we stop giving subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which are the richest companies in the world in many cases. So the money is there. I'm not asking you, Jordan, or you, Neal, to start forking out thousands of dollars a year to build solar plants in India. Though if you want to do that, please go ahead and do so. But you don't need to. That money is within some of the richest people and richest corporations within nations in the global North. We just need to allocate our resources better. Again, this is largely a case of resource allocation. And we need to be helping developing nations level up to where we are now. But instead of getting there with fossil fuels, as we have in the 20th century, get there with renewable energy. And we have the technology to do that. We just need to figure out a few things and scale it up and invest in it. So that's what I would say to the, well, what about China? What about India argument?
That's really enlightening, to realize that China is spending more than anyone else on innovating in this area, and I guess that's to their I don't want to speak about the regime particularly over there. I don't really understand it either, but I know that whoever wins the kind of arms race towards effective carbon capture or innovating to the most effective forms of renewable energy, that's going to benefit the nation. Because a lot of the companies over there, I believe, are nationalized. It's going to benefit the nation that creates them. But Andrew has been waiting for a long time to get in. So Andrew, if you're there, I'm going to add you to the stream, and we'll hear from you and see what you've got to say.
Hey, yeah, can you hear me?
Hey, Andrew.
You can.
Okay.
Andrew.
Yeah, so one of the issues is like I've been trying to, I like to recycle, I like to do all that stuff, but I work in the oil sands, and that's always something that like I think about, especially when I'm out there. And it's not just the oil that's the problem. Like it's a big issue, but there's a very wasteful area. So one example is after the pandemic, they used to have these like orange containers for water when it gets really warm out. But they replaced that with just buying like crates upon crates of bottled water. And the amount, and you can recycle some of it, but most of it just goes in the garbage, along with other things like old gloves. Sometimes gloves are just used for 1 quarter and then it's raining, so that they got to be disposed of. You have a lot of like plastics, like half masks, for instance, which I actually have a bunch of. I probably stolen a lot from. Listen, I don't really mind stealing from a billion-dollar oil company, but a lot of that stuff that I did take would have been thrown away, like rubber boots, for instance. $100 rubber boots would have been just thrown in the garbage. Coveralls, hard hats, everything like that. And I always think about that when I come home, and I just like recycle every cardboard thing, and then there's just a garbage filled with fucking water bottles everywhere. So it's almost like this like mental thing of like, yeah, basically everything behind me here in my wacky little setup in my house and my ability to travel in my car and everything I got from the oil sands. But I also know that I'm kind of contributing to the problem just by working there. So yeah. Yeah. It's tough. It's because like I might not be working until next year, and like I got to watch all of the invasion from like, well, not all of it, from all of the July Raws and SmackDowns, and I got to hang with my dog, and I don't do anything. I just stay in my house, and I go out sometimes, but all of that is based on the money that I was able to get from the oil sands.
I wonder if like our collective silence in response is maybe indicative of kind of the stuckness many of us feel when it just comes to these issues and the ways in which we contribute. I think for some of us, it may feel like inevitable, like we're not left with much choice. I know, Jesse, you were speaking earlier to ways in which we can contribute less to this environmental dysfunction. But just like this topic, relative to many of the other topics that we've explored for the past 3 years on these episodes, I don't know, this conversation has a different vibe or tone just in my own being right now, where it feels like from a scientific point of view, but also from a like geopolitical point of view, it just seems so beyond me. And it's hard, it's confusing, it's overwhelming, it's hard to grasp in all kinds of different ways. I don't know if you have anything to speak to that, Jesse, but I'm just noticing my own experience in this conversation, and there's ways in which I can feel inspired, but it just also feels like a lot.
It is a lot. And I think Andrew's touched on some really important points there. first, and Andrew, I don't know you. I don't know how you feel. I'm just judging by the few things you said. And I hope you know that you've earned your money, right? Like you've earned everything you create. You worked hard for that money, right? That's it.
Yes.
So it's not like the oil sands have gifted you this. You earned that. You worked hard to make a lot of rich people even richer. So
Yes.
You've earned everything you've worked for. And in terms of employment, a lot of countries, employ a lot of people in the fossil fuel industry. Those people need jobs. They need ways to support their families. So, and every country is different in terms of what industries it can move towards. But what we have to do as we move away from fossil fuels, we have to offer people who work in those industries opportunities to retrain, to get jobs, in a renewable energy sector, perhaps, or whatever sector makes sense for that country. So you go to a bunch of people like, hey, we're not going to drill for oil anymore. That means you can't do this work, but we're not going to just cut you dry and make you fend for yourself. Perhaps you'd like to retrain in order to build solar panels, in order to build high-speed rail, in order to, work in marketing or communications for more sustainable energy, whatever makes sense for that person, for that country, for that industry, right? We cannot just cut people loose and let them fend for themselves. And that speaks to the broader problem, which I think, Jordan, you were hinting at. It's like, wow, this is big. It's like, we need to change a lot about how our society works. And I think that's also evidenced in what Andrew's talking about in just terms of the plastic, all the water bottles. We just throw it out, we recycle it. Plastic water bottles, even if you have recycling, there's a good chance they're not really recycled. We need to we need to finally open our eyes and remember or take note of how wasteful our society is, right? Like just walking to the store and getting a coffee with a coffee cup and throwing it out when we're done. That can't keep happening by the end of the century, basically. We could forget plastic coffee cups or paper. We could grow that with corn. We could basically make biodegradable coffee cups. That's great, right? Well, except for the fact that we're using precious arable land and not using it to grow something we're just going to throw out. That doesn't make sense either. For us people living in a city, we're probably going to have to get to the point where we are used to carrying around a metal or glass water bottle and a metal or glass or even just any sort of reusable mug to travel with us, right? And if you personally do it, that will make no difference to anyone. If we all do it, that's the difference, which again speaks to this broader issue that Jordan's been talking about, the sense of helplessness. And so I think Andrew actually has done something really great there, where he just mentioned some sort of pretty mundane, everyday aspect of his life that at one point he took note of. It's like, wow, we are generating a lot of waste in this job. And I don't know a lot about the nature of actually working in the tar sands and how much of that is avoidable or not. Certain things like medical waste really do seem intractable. You can't reuse a lot of medical products, so it has to be thrown out after one use. But I don't necessarily know that we need to tackle all those problems when there's just, regular people are going to the store and buying 48 plastic water bottles, and that's what they drink every week. That should not be the case. They should be able to just drink water from their tap. And if they're not able to do that, that's a failure of their government, and they need to lobby the government to say, give us clean tap water. It's also a failure of advertising communication, as you mentioned earlier, Jordan. Many of us think that water from a plastic bottle is healthier from the tap, and now there are microplastics in our bodies. Everywhere we look for microplastics, there are microplastics. So yeah, we need to obviously reduce plastic use, but that's only going to happen when we consider how wasteful our society is in terms of we buy things. You're buying a can of cola, but then you have an aluminum can with BPA lining left over. Actually, aluminum is very recyclable, so that's not so bad. But you have to recognize that almost everything we do generates a certain amount of waste. It's like, wow, we need to work on that. But like I said, it doesn't pay to despair. And Jordan, you've brought up something that's similar to climate anxiety a few times. And I don't know if you want to get into that now, but I think it's probably worth touching on the wellness policy to talk about climate anxiety and what to do about it. But I don't know if Andrew has anything he'd like to add or respond to in any of that.
Well, maybe Andrew left us. I
Oh.
saw another acoustic guitar in his frame. I was going to see if he could play us something. I suppose not. I also think I saw a pair of those like Nintendo Donkey Kong congas. I believe that's what it was.
Yeah.
Andrew's with us.
He's back.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, they are.
All right, now we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah, I actually brought this up on the post. No, it was the Poison Rana Christmas party, but this is a Jeff Jarrett TNA guitar.
Oh wow,
Beautiful.
beautiful.
But yeah, I do have the bongos as well. I have a whole little set here. But one of the couple of things I did want to bring up in regards to government issues. So where I work, well, I also like theoretically I could move my card from Alberta. Like I'm in the scaffolding, I'm in the carpenters union. So I build scaffolding so that they can do stuff. So I do have other job outside of the actual oil sands. I just think they need scaffolders. So that could be done in like I'm guessing for like more environmentally friendly places. But like one of the issues with the government, especially in Alberta, is I work around asbestos, and they have which is illegal in most places. But there's a lot of pipes that like Suncor, a lot of those places that was built in the 60s. So there's asbestos in a lot of the pipes in some of the older plants. And you report like if anything's exposed, but a lot of guys they'll just leave it there and they'll just like ignore it and just like go on with their day, So that's kind of an issue with the government, where like the government of Alberta will never ban asbestos because they would have to tear apart the Suncor base plant pretty much.
Wow. That's very interesting to me because asbestos has been, illegal in my country for many years,
Yeah.
and anywhere it's found, it has to be. It doesn't matter the size of the building or what it's used for. It's got to be very carefully removed, because of
Even like
mesothelioma, I think is the
Yeah.
disease that it's most closely tied with.
yeah. There's a school. Sorry, if I just want to
Please.
mention that there was a school that was torn down in North Sydney, like close to me, and it had asbestos in it, and it was torn down. And anything in Nova Scotia, if it has asbestos in it, it's gone. But Alberta is a little different,
I think it comes back to what Jesse was sharing earlier, that it's not just us making these lifestyle changes, but also including some sense of political engagement, even at the most local of levels. Sometimes that can actually be the most effective form of political engagement. Like one way in which I feel, I guess, hopeful or optimistic. I'm using a terribly uncomfortable, tragic example, but lockdown in 2020 showed me how quickly the world at large, but also individual countries and communities can change. Whether it was wearing masks. I had never worn a mask in my entire life. Just that was not a cultural norm. But within a matter of weeks, that very much became the norm for many people. But there was real leadership, whether in the form of laws being created, rules or restrictions being created, or more cultural leadership, whether it's doctors or other officials saying, hey, doing this new behavior, unfamiliar behavior or habit is in the best interest of both you, your health, and the people that you love, and the communities that you're a part of. So I guess just with that example, Andrew, it's like if we had leadership, then I feel like some of these things, if not many of these things, would be possible.
But I think in that example, the threat was immediate, and we actually had examples of people dying around us. So
Yes.
everybody,
Mhm.
regardless of whether or not you respected your leadership, at least I think could take it seriously. With something like, all of these topics that you've been talking about, they're not felt often by us. They're going to be felt by future generations. So it's not as immediate, and therefore I think it's a lot tougher to drive people to action. And I think that's a challenge, which is like why I'm so fascinated by you, Jesse, because you are so passionate about this to the point where I get the sense that you do see how immediate all of this is and how threatening it is to you. And I guess I'm just so curious, like, what do you think it is about you that you feel this way that others may not?
I don't know. To be honest, I'm sometimes confused that this doesn't seem to weigh as heavily on other people. I don't know why it doesn't. I think perhaps the answer is simply that because of my, education, which is not in this sphere, but I'm a university graduate, so I have developed critical thinking skills. I was raised by parents who encouraged me to be curious, to question things. I've always been interested in reading, researching, learning about new topics, and this is, to me, the most important topic that there is. So it made sense for me to learn more about it. And I do have the privileges of, I don't have to work, 2 jobs to support, a family or anything. I don't have to put the kids to bed. I don't have all these other pressing issues. I do have probably more free time than most people, as evidenced by how the pure amount of 1999 WCW Nitro I've watched. So I think part of it comes from a place of privilege. I have the ability to spend more time learning about this, but I'm also not the best example of it. There are people who are far more knowledgeable and spend more of their time and effort working for environmental organizations than I do. People who both do it as a profession and people who do it because they recognize the same things I recognize and are even more knowledgeable and more active in those communities. So I'm not particularly special. It's just, within this post wrestling community of people who, have been on podcasts before, I'm one who's talked about this probably the most. And so I think I was probably the one you thought of for this issue. And maybe it also speaks to my inability to relax sometimes.
Well, sorry, Jesse, you mentioned just climate anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you just feel more of that, which compels you to act.
I would say it's the other way around, or at least it's a loop. I feel more of it because I know more about it. I didn't wake up one day feeling like, oh, gee, I wonder what the climate's been like, and then get into it. No, I learn more, and then I read more, and then I become ever more anxious and ever more angry. And sometimes despairing. In terms of, I just think that I probably had the time and the for whatever sparked that initial inclination, the interest in reading about it, and now. Once you start reading about it and learn more about it, I think it would be natural for anyone in my position and probably the positions of you 3 guys and many of our listeners to learn more and start doing something about it. And I think Wei really hit the nail on the head, right? COVID happened quickly and right in front of us. And we're like, okay, we have to act. But last year was the first time in my lifetime that I walked outside of my home here in Toronto and smelled smoke because of forest fires, right? It's happening in front of us now. And more people are becoming aware of climate change and the dangers therein because of that. And it will become more and more immediate. So while that's bad, because it means more bad things will happen, hopefully it also spurs more of us into action as we are no longer able to think, oh, that's something that's going to happen, 10, 20 years, or like, yeah, it'll suck for people in Bangladesh and New Orleans, but I'll be okay. It's like, A, that's not a great way to think about it, and B, probably not true. It will affect you personally, and it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can. Figuring that out is the hard part, though.
I'd also argue, though, that our leaders and our media could be making it a greater priority and with a
Absolutely.
greater sense of urgency to educate the populace of, hey, this is serious and perhaps dire and has real present day consequences that can affect you from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, and so on.
And I feel like that's happened before. I mean, we just mentioned the pandemic, and of course that was an immediate threat. People, every day we were seeing the death toll rise. I think CNN had a kind of a live, this is the number of people who are dead sort of counter in the corner of their screen. But I'm old enough to remember when the threat that was always talked about environmentally was the hole in the ozone layer. And it felt as though that you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Jesse, about the sort of causation of it. Seems to be at that time propellants in aerosols. I think they were called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons or something.
Yeah.
And also refrigerants that were used in, your household fridge and things like that. And of course, on an industrial level, much bigger. And action was taken to get rid of those chemicals from those products. And as far as I know, the ozone layer is now kind of okay. Like, it's nature has healed in that respect. So I don't know that there's a direct comparison to be drawn with greenhouse gases, but it feels like that was a situation where there was an environmental threat. Action was taken on an international level by governments, and we had a positive outcome. So maybe I'm overplaying it, but it feels like, we can do something.
At least it was a proof of concept in terms of international action solving a global problem that didn't have any one specific cause in terms of it's not like this one country did this one thing and caused this global problem. No, CFCs were in many products produced by many countries. We got together, we stopped emitting them, and the ozone layer has been, over the Antarctic, has been re-enveloping. It's been healing, for want of a better term. Now, that's also because we already had ready-made replacements. It wasn't nearly as difficult to move away from CFCs as it has and will be to move away from fossil fuels, which is why we haven't done it already. But the proof of concept is there. We know we can do this because we've already done it. And yes, so many of the barriers we have to creating a sustainable future are political, are economic in terms of the short term, in terms of short-term economic disruption, in terms of how we live our lives, the way we practice consumerism. There will be hiccups to overcome. But as I pointed out earlier, in terms of the cost of inaction, it will actually benefit our economy to fix this as soon as we can and move to a power grid based on largely on renewable energy.
And I feel like if we had leadership of some form speaking in these terms, really stating the case for how maybe what feels like short-term inconveniences can actually help us avoid greater future-term pain in some way, and also lead us to greater prosperity in the future, economically and otherwise. I think a lot of us could get on board with that. Obviously, there's going to be a portion of the populace that is not interested in these ideas and would even actively work to reject these ideas. But this is just a gut sense that most people, I think, are kind of on board with this idea of there might be a better way. And I think if most people, including the leadership of government and business at large, were willing to go in a different direction, I think many of us could get on board with it. Again, I feel like a lot of my the difficulty I experience is it's like it's on me, or it's on us in a wrestling podcast community to chat about these things amongst ourselves, and there isn't some greater collective leadership when it comes to these conversations.
So I'm a lot more pessimistic, I think, when it comes to that feeling. I think, well, first of all, I think leaders, especially elected leaders, are going to mostly say what they think people want to hear. They're going to platform depending on what they mainly want people want to hear. And there are so many issues right now, so many topics that are, I think, at the front of people's minds that are a lot more immediate, unfortunately, than something like this, which should be immediate. But I don't think there's enough, like, sort of, I hate to use the word, but like fear sort of like conveying for people to treat this as, you know, seriously as like they did COVID, or I don't know, the local traffic or public transit or something like that, things that have an immediate impact. And for that reason, I mean, I do think like education is the primary thing, which I think Jesse is doing a great job of, you know, offering here. I think so much of this conversation for me is about like long-term thinking and caring about like people other than maybe yourself, you know, caring about future generations. Like, to put it to wrestling terms, I consider this as like long-term booking for like a WrestleMania versus like week-to-week hotshotting, you know, of your ankles, just to kind of satisfy your crowds for like, you know, the next 24 hours. What is this sort of like thing we can do right now so that like 2 years from now we have an incredible payoff and like we enjoy like, you know, great success like in the industry. And it's hard to get people to think that way. It's hard to convey patience and tell people that what they're doing right now is worth it.
I think, sorry, I just wanted to mention that once again, Wei has brought up a great segue in that all the issues people care about right now are also related to climate change and or the causes, or they share a cause. You mentioned traffic. Yeah, you know what would ease traffic? A train, a subway system, better buses, a tram system. That would also be a climate solution. People are concerned about the cost of groceries. Now, right now, the groceries are expensive largely because of greedflation, and it is greedflation. You can look it up, but we have the data. Prices of food are high mostly because grocery stores want to make more money, and food producers want to make more money. But food prices will also be very high as we experience more droughts and famines. That will crop failures. That will make life very hard for even relatively well-off middle-class people. Not to say of those people who are near the poverty line or living in developing nations. And for those issues that don't have a direct link to climate change, often the cause is the same, which is a system that funnels more money towards the wealthy and more resources towards the wealthy and fewer to regular people. We've seen a huge wealth transfer in just the past 4 years, starting with the pandemic. A huge wealth transfer. That's our money going to the richest people on the planet. We're going to have to reverse that if we're going to effectively tackle climate change. And this is, you know, that's a political statement. And, you know, I know post-wrestling does not like to come out here and deal with politics too much or say vote for this person, don't vote for that person. But it's impossible. It would be a dereliction of duty on my part to not say that climate solutions are also social justice solutions, are also political solutions, are also racial justice solutions in terms of many of the people in the global south who will get hit first and hardest by climate change are racialized people. In rich countries, the people who live in cities will live in heat islands where they don't have access to air conditioning and there's no shade around them, just pavement. Their homes will heat up faster than anyone else. And those are often racialized communities because of centuries of, you know, institutional racism. All these problems are interconnected. So whatever passion you have politically or socially, there's very likely a climate link. And there are ways we can work together to create solutions that benefit both what you're passionate about, what I'm passionate about, and what can benefit all of us at the expense of basically like 40 super rich guys who will be slightly less rich. That's an oversimplification. That's generally what I'm advocating for, and that's generally what it would take. So I really would love for more unity whenever possible, because it doesn't have to be a left or right issue. Climate change will affect us all, some of us before others. But it's ridiculous. I mean, we haven't even talked about climate denial, which is the idea that the world's richest companies, Saudi Aramco and ExxonMobil, are the victims of some left-wing climate scientist conspiracy. Like, if you just think about it for 8 seconds, it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
I was going to touch on that, Jesse, in as much as saying that a big takeaway from this discussion for me is that I really wish this was being taught to kids in school. But there's a political element there where, you know, and denialism is at one end of it, but you don't need to go even that far. There's sort of skepticism somewhere there where it's like, no, that's a leftist agenda and we're not teaching our kids that, you know. It's sort of
I do think so. But almost, I didn't do any research on this, but like a strong majority of every population believes in climate change and believes is at least partially caused by humans. Even oil companies have admitted that they are responsible, at least partly, for climate change. Often politicians, at least half of them, do not admit that, which goes back to Jordan's point on failure of leadership. But yeah, I think the biggest impediment is not climate denialism. It's more like, yeah, I'm sure it's a problem, but man, you know, I got to get to work, and you know, I got groceries are really expensive, and I care about that, and you know, and I got to focus on, is democracy eroding? Is that the biggest issue for me where I live? People have more immediate concerns. It's not clear to them how the climate affects them. And then there are also many people spending a lot of money to get people concerned about things that don't really matter or don't have a clear government solution. It's like, oh, well, I hate rainbow flags. Well, I think that's silly, but okay, you can hate rainbow flags if you want to. That doesn't mean you can't also fight against climate change. You know, it's like, let's focus on something that really matters, something that we can actually legislate for, you can create policies for, that will help all of us. So yeah, I think it's just getting people to recognize that the problems they face do have connections to climate justice, and that actually what they want, if they see themselves as political or apolitical, are also what you want. We pretty much everyone who can hear me wants the same things I want. You just maybe don't think of it in the same way, or you maybe don't realize it. There are different ways to get there, and these people can disagree on the best way to accomplish certain things. But let's take a page from the experts who know what they're talking about, which is all I try to do. I am not a climate scientist. So by all means, if you hear me and you're like, is that true? I did source pretty much everything I said today, but absolutely research it. And if you go to reputable sites, you'll find the same things I found. And then once we recognize that, we can work together and kind of leave all the culture war BS behind and just understand that many of our goals are actually the same. And it's the leadership and the people who have the billions of dollars already who are incentivized to make us work against each other, when actually we will benefit by working together.
Jesse, as we start to wrap up, for those listening and watching who want more of this type of information or discussion or inspiration, are there some resources you can offer, whether it's a podcast, an organization, someone in the world who you feel like is doing a really effective job of raising their hand and saying, I'm going to help lead in the thinking and the strategies around some of these issues?
Okay. Yes, I can. In terms of, well, you don't have to be Canadian, but the David Suzuki Foundation is, I think, a really excellent foundation for science communication. David Suzuki is a Canadian documentarian and environmentalist. he's got to be like 90 now, but his foundation, I'm on their email news list. You can sign up for the newsletter or go to their website to check it out. I'm sure they have social media accounts you can follow. In Canada, there's a group called Lead Now that works towards they're not affiliated with any political party, but they work towards getting more social justice and environmental justice candidates in office and making people aware of their options. You could look at them, see if they do work that you're interested in. In terms of, I want to be careful because there are a lot of news sites and environmental groups that I follow, and I don't always agree with all of them. So I think they do a good job of communication, but I don't really want to recommend them necessarily because I don't necessarily want to tell people that, yes, this is exactly how you should think. Hank Green is a science communicator online. He doesn't just touch on climate change. Sometimes he just explains weird viral videos you see. But I think he's very good at science communication, and when it comes to climate communication. Those are some options you can get involved with. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
And what about yourself, Jesse? Are you open to perhaps if people have questions and want to maybe get in touch with you directly?
Yeah, sure. I'm open to that. I'm not really on Twitter much anymore, as many of us are not.
Would you like to share your home address, Jesse?
Maybe not. Maybe not. You could Instagram, I guess is fine. You can message me on Instagram. I think I have private right now. I'll go public. It's Jesse from the Six. I think you can find me. What exactly is it? Is that if you search Jesse from the Six?
We'll link it in your profile.
If you're like, hey man, I was listening to you and I want to follow a good climate account, I can send you one with the caveat that you don't necessarily have to agree with every point they make, but there are many options out there for science communicators online on YouTube and stuff,
including yourself, Jesse. Jesse's an excellent follow on Instagram, and you'll often make them funny as well. The messages that you put up on your stories and stuff, which is I think helps, sweeten the bitter pill for some people.
Jesse, are you familiar with this book, The Carbon Almanac?
I'm not. No.
Okay, The Carbon Almanac. It's not too late. I have not read it, but it is championed by Seth Godin, someone that I've talked about on previous podcasts here. Seth Godin is more well known in the fields of marketing and communication and leadership, but it seems like this is the result or part of a project of dozens of experts from around the world. Again, I haven't read this book, but Seth Godin is someone that I have paid attention to for well over 15 years now. He is someone that has earned my trust, meaning that if this is a project that not only he really backs, but has used a significant amount of his time and energy in the past few years to share this book and these ideas with his audience. If it's important to him, then it certainly speaks to me as something that may be important to me as well. So I just Googled Seth Godin climate, and this is what came up, The Carbon Almanac. It's a book, and probably more than just a book. I'd imagine there's an organization around it as well. In part inspired by this conversation today, I think that is one of the first places I will start as far as continuing to engage with these topics. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us, dude.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me on here. I hope I've said something that someone will find useful. If you take nothing else away from this, I just want people to know that if you feel anxious about anything you've learned today or anything you read, if you have climate anxiety, my first thing to say would be good, you should be anxious. There is reason to feel angst. And my recommendation is the best way to deal with that is to do something, is to get involved, take action. You're only one person. Your individual choices will not change the trajectory of our civilization. But if you get involved, and even if you and your community group can make one small change, you will feel good about it, and you'll feel good knowing that, hey, at least I'm trying and I'm doing something for myself, for other people, and for future generations. And if it ever feels like it's a bit too much and you just need to take a step back, that's okay. Relax, put on a WCW Nitro from 1999 and just realize we've got through horrible things before, and we can get through this too.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Much appreciated. And thank you, Neal and Jordan, for at the very last minute figuring all of this out. Neal, especially, MVP of the show, other than Jesse, of course. So we'll be back next month. Thank you guys for being here. Bye bye.